Hey everyone, I'm Andy Petronic, and this is the Whole Life Challenge podcast. It's the place we connect with extraordinary people, ones who think differently, who have risen to the top of their field, who have vast knowledge, experience, and insights to share, as well as incredible stories to tell. They are also the ones who have figured out a way to take their life's experience and turn it into something that truly makes a difference in the world for others. These are their stories. Hey gang, it's Andy Petronic, and I'm back with another episode of the Whole Life Podcast. This is episode number 123. Did you like episode number 122 with Chris Kresser? If you haven't listened to it, go back. Do yourself a favor and go back and listen to it. I mean, his message about the general status of health in the world is too important to not listen to. It's probably the most important podcast. I'm just preempting myself. Maybe the most important podcast I do all year. It's important that we know of the problem and we know of some of the possible solutions. Chris is an amazing health and wellness practitioner, and he's tackled this in a very profound way and offers both some of the dramatic data about how bad the situation is, but he also offers his insights into how it's changeable. But today, in episode 123, I've got an incredible guest. His name is Patrick McKeown. He has written a book called The Oxygen Advantage, and it was a lot of times when I read my guests' books, I plan on skimming them, or I plan on looking at the beginning of every chapter and not really reading the whole book prior to my interview. And I couldn't put this book down. It is so. First of all, Patrick presents not a hypothesis, because it's something he's actually worked with for many, many years with thousands of people and seen and demonstrated the effectiveness. But it's a argument against deep breathing and for shallow breathing. Yeah. Now, before you dismiss that and just say, yeah, whatever, come on, that's crazy. It's not crazy. It sounds crazy. I thought it was crazy when I first read about it, and it is not at all. It makes 100% sense around the utilization of oxygen by your tissues in your body. And it's a breathing system that was actually started back in the 30s by a Russian doctor named Dr. Buteyko. And Patrick has worked directly with Dr. Buteyko and has graduated with a degree from his academy. Dr. Buteyko has passed on, but Patrick carries on his work through the Buteyko Clinic. And he's kind of on a mission to change the world because it's so opposite what everyone thinks. Breathe less. You're breathing too much. Huh? Don't take deep breaths. Huh? It makes no sense, right? So you're going to have to listen to this podcast because we go into all the nitty-gritty details, but we do it in a way that's very understandable. You don't have to have a degree in chemistry or in biology to understand what he's talking about. You may have to listen a few times. I had to listen to the podcast over and again, and then I have to read the book over and again to remember some of the things that he's talking about. But I can't think of something actually more important than your breath. You know, one of the things Patrick says in the podcast is that he thinks the next level of human performance will come from the development and work with breathing. Nasal breathing, actually, if you want to get more specific. Getting people away from mouth breathing and toward nasal breathing. And you'll understand a lot more about that if you give yourself about an hour and 20 minutes, or you listen to your podcast on a little faster speed, like I do. You could listen to it 2 times speed's pretty fast. You could listen to 1.5 speed and probably retain quite a lot. I find that very useful. So that's coming up in about, 2 or 3 minutes as soon as I get done with this intro. Fan of the week. Let's talk about fan of the week. First of all, I really appreciate you guys putting in your reviews to iTunes. I can't really get this podcast out into the world without your reviews. So if you take a minute to leave a review, I look at my reviews regularly, and I will mention you on air as a fan of the week. If you take the time to write a review, go to this link, bit.ly/WLC-podcast. That will actually open up iTunes on your computer, and you'll have to click a link that says ratings and reviews, and then you can click write a review. And, write a review of one episode. You can write a review of the whole podcast. You can write a review of you can talk about the results you got trying on some of the techniques you learned in a podcast, whatever you want to talk about. But I'm going to read the fan of the week this week, and it's from Ashley E. Hankins. And by the way, if I read your review on air and you hear me reading your review on air, send me an email, podcast@wholelifechallenge.com, and I'll send you a t-shirt. So I know it's a little gesture, but it's something at least to acknowledge the fact that I really, really appreciate you guys doing these. So here's what Ashley says. Really enjoyed listening to this podcast. I took my first break from social media, not as in depth as no phone at all, but it's all about the baby steps, right? It was so refreshing not to start my day with all the noise we find on social media nowadays. I was shocked at the amount of free time I had. I can absolutely agree with the not wanting to give it up at first and then not wanting it back by the last day. By the way, she's talking about the episode with Joe DiStefano, which is probably 5 or 6 episodes ago. This is a great listen. I have a few friends who are really big on Spartan races, so it was neat to listen to the way Joe will train those who look to compete and how they use kettlebells due to the multiple ways to incorporate them for preparation of different carries during the races. So thank you, Ashley. If you hear this introduction, again, send me an email and I'll send you a t-shirt, and I really appreciate those reviews. So guys, please keep them coming. Let's see, another bit of housekeeping. The Whole Life Challenge starts the end of this week. Yes. January 20th is the first day of the Whole Life Challenge. And listen, I'm going to have a team. I have a team in every challenge. And this team name, if you want to be on my team, do a search once you sign up for the challenge for Getting Out of the Comfort Zone. Getting Out of the Comfort Zone. You can also do a search for Andy Petronic, and you'll probably find me and my team, and you can join my team. It's open to any, I say friends and family, but listen, you guys are all friends and family if you listen to the podcast. So I'd love you to be on my team and participate in the January challenge with me. Really, really excited. And by the way, today's guest on the challenge inspired the first lifestyle practice of the challenge, which is mindful breathing. So you'll understand more after you listen to the podcast, but it's really breathing just as little as possible in order to get the oxygen you need, but it's slightly uncomfortable. It's spending 10 minutes of just sitting, being, and breathing. And so don't forget, you can check out all the show notes from this episode on at the Whole Life Challenge, wholelifechallenge.com/podcast. And if you have any questions or want to hit me up about anything, you can do so at podcast@wholelifechallenge.com, or you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter at Andy Petronic. So that's enough of me rambling. Let's get on with the podcast and Patrick McKeown. So get ready for the one and the only Patrick McKeown. Bing, bang, boom. All right, so here we go. Patrick McKeown, welcome to the Whole Life Podcast.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's great to be here.
As I was saying before we hit record, I'm always amazed that the technology works. Patrick's in Ireland and I'm in Santa Monica, and it's just cool to turn the computer on, and I'm seeing him. You're not seeing him, but I'm seeing him, and we're recording audio, so it's great.
Yeah, no, it's one of the things. Like, I'm in the west coast of Ireland. It's pretty much it's a very barren, isolated place, and I live here for a reason. I love having no neighbours. I love having total peace and quiet. And the next stop is the Atlantic Ocean, and that's what the internet has done. The internet has just opened up this to a whole wide audience. It's really made the world a very, very small place. So it's good in that aspect.
So that's a negative for you because you can't get away.
Well, you know what I do, because I control it. I have my mobile phone is only to take and make calls.
Right.
When I bought the phone, this guy anyway in the phones shop, he sold me up from your basic phone about 7 years ago to the best thing ever was a smartphone.
Uh-huh.
I had a smartphone for 3 days. I was totally distracted by Facebook, by websites, by emails, and I rang up Vodafone and I said, "Listen, get me off this thing. I want it."
Did you go back to the old school?
I went to, yeah. I have a Samsung, a second grade, the second version ever, and all it can do is make and receive calls. It's pretty much useless.
There's something to that. I don't think that's so bad, actually.
I think there's a benefit for it. I really think we need to control the amount of exposure that we have. The mind is getting very distracted.
Yep.
And with a distracted mind, there's a lot of negatives about it. Now, there's a lot of positives about the internet, but there's also many negatives.
Yeah,
and we have
absolutely.
to be careful. I think it's that balance, so it is.
It's funny because in the mornings, I call the first hour of the morning the golden hour. And I try to do my best at doing things that will really serve my inner self. Like I try to meditate, and then and I write, and when I'm on track and I haven't allowed my phone to get in the way of doing those things, it's great. And I keep a little record of it. But when I don't do that, I mean, it's amazing how quickly I fall into I read one email, and then all of a sudden, 20 minutes later, I don't know where the time went.
Yeah, and it captures you.
It's really, really weird, and I'm very conscious of it. I mean, I'm paying attention to that time in that hour, and it still happens. So
this is Big Brother.
Yeah. It's interesting. Well, I first learned about you and your work. I was listening to Dave Asprey's podcast, the Bulletproof podcast, and I heard you on there, and I downloaded the book. And, it's funny because I read a lot of books just because I have a lot of guests on my podcast, and I try to at least skim what I've read. But your book, I couldn't put down. Wow. Not only did I download the book, I downloaded the Audible book. Okay. Because I was like, okay, I got to keep going in this. And I found myself driving a lot and not having time to read. So I'm like, okay, well, I got to keep reading the book. So I got to get the audio version of the book. And so I have both. And I don't have a lot of books where I have both of the books downloaded. And,
wow, that's a great endorsement.
Yeah, no, it just was, I guess it appealed to my, I have a bit of a rebel side. Like I'm a very early adopter in things. And when I hear somebody talk about something that flies in the face of everything I've ever read or heard or learned, or I don't necessarily adopt it, but I am always intrigued. I'm always like, well, sure. That's interesting. That happened to me about 5 years ago when I read an article about, have you ever heard of the no poo, no shampoo movement? No. They call it no poo. Okay. And I read an article about no shampoo, and I started experimenting without using shampoo, and I used some vinegar, and and then I took it to another level, and I stopped using soap, and I start using this oil, like an oil-based thing, and I found that, I don't know, it's been like 4 or 5 years I haven't used shampoo or soap, and I'm totally fine. I'm intrigued by those things, and oxygen and breathing is so. I mean, it's kind of like I don't know if Danny Dreyer was on the podcast a few weeks ago. He's a chi running expert.
Yes, yeah. And, no, he's very good. I know Danny.
And Danny was talking about. Oh, I just lost my train of thought. Crap. We were talking about bolt scores, and we were talking about how he said he's up to about a 20 bolt score during a run. and a Bolt. We'll get into the Bolt score for everybody listening, what that is.
Mm-hmm.
But I was blown away. I'm like, what? Because my Bolt score is about 20.
Yes, during rest.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is just so intriguing to me. Breathing is such a normal part of just everyday life. You don't even think about it. You don't think about how to run. That's what I was thinking about Danny Dreyer. People don't think like you need to learn how to run because you just start running when you're a kid and you just run. So like, what's there to learn? It's
true, Andy, but you know what? This would have been correct 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. This would have been correct when we spend most of our waking day doing physical work, as opposed to sitting down in front of computers and laptops, as opposed to sitting down on school desks, carrying heavy school bags to school. I think a lot of these influences, our way of life has totally changed and our breathing has totally changed. And I just looked at a paper there very recently. I was in Sydney doing sports training with athletes. And one of the papers that we were looking at, and these were looking at athletes, these were healthy individuals, 50 to 60% of them had poor breathing patterns. And that's pretty amazing. And the reason that this paper was looking at it was because if an athlete has a poor breathing pattern, it increases the risk of injury. So a poor breathing pattern would be excessive use of the upper chest muscles, for example, during rest.
Yep.
And a low Bolt score. The distinguishing factor that differentiates good breathing from poor breathing is if your breath hold time after an exhalation, if you're comfortable breath hold time after an exhalation, if it's less than 20 or 25 seconds, it's poor breathing patterns. If it's above 25, it's pretty good. If it's 40, it's excellent.
How do you distinguish that Bolt score, that time? How do you distinguish the end of it? Because I'm always kind of in my head, well, is this the right time? Should I go another 3 or 4 seconds? What's the end?
Yeah.
How do you?
Yeah, it's taught like the breath hold time that we use is nothing new. It's been written about for about 30. It's written about since 1975 for 40 years now. Stanley first wrote about it then. He said you can measure your chemosensitivity by holding your breath. And your chemosensitivity is very important because when you do physical exercise, your blood gases change. And how your breathing center reacts to those blood gases will determine how breathless you are during your physical exercise. So the breath hold time during rest gives you a good indication. It's an indirect measurement of your end-tidal CO2, or basically your CO2 tolerance. And it's carbon dioxide is the stimulus to breathe, not oxygen. In actual fact, the human body is probably 40 to 50 times more sensitive to carbon dioxide than it is to a drop of oxygen. And the body breathes to get rid of excess CO2. So in terms of the Bolt time, we don't want a measurement that's going to be influenced by willpower or determination. And as a result, then we're holding the breath. So basically, we sit down for about, say, 5 to 10 minutes, and you have normal breathing. And you take a normal breath in through your nose, a normal breath out through your nose, and you pinch your nose with your fingers. And you hold your breath until you feel the first distinct reaction of your body to breathe. And that's your Bolt. Now, it's the first distinct reaction. So everybody will feel it a little bit differently. Now, you may feel it. Now, if you think of it this way, if you're holding your breath, at some point your brain is going to send a message to breathe, and that's going to be your Bolt score. So it's measuring how long does it take for your brain to react to the change in the blood gases. And it's a pretty good measurement for the onset, for a measurement to give you some feedback on the onset and endurance of breathlessness. So say, for instance, if you have a runner and they want to get an idea of, how soon will they get breathless and how breathless will they be over a run, Bolt is a pretty good score. Now, we have a second score, which is the number of paces, the maximum number of paces that you can hold your breath for. And this one is you take a normal breath in, normal breath out, you pinch your nose, you hold your breath, and you walk as many paces as you can. And you keep walking until it gets pretty difficult. And then you let go, you breathe through your nose, and you calm your breathing. That measures the absolute upper limit of tolerance of breathlessness. So we have two scores. We have the Bolt, which is measuring the onset and endurance. And then we can also measure what's the maximum tolerance of breathlessness that an individual can endure.
And that's more willpower. Good. That second one is more willpower.
Yeah, the second one is totally influenced by willpower and determination. Now, traditionally, I used it for the nose and blocking exercise. But then I was looking at when I was working with athletes, especially sprinters and MMA fighters, where they're working really anaerobically. I was thinking to myself, like, what's the maximum tolerance that they can endure? And so we started using it in that aspect for, to give us feedback. And I had Olympic athletes in during the week. They were reaching about 60 paces, that they can hold their breath for 60 paces after an exhalation.
This is walking.
This is while walking, yes.
Okay.
So this is the maximum tolerance, and the goal is about 100. So so a bolt score. Oftentimes with an athlete, we commonly see athletes in around 20 seconds, but the goal is 40. William McArley, who wrote a book, I think it was 2009, it was published, Exercise, Nutrition and Physical Performance, I think is the name of it. But in that book, he says, if an athlete exhales, they should be able to hold their breath for 40 seconds before the urge to initiate inspiration begins. In other words, you can hold your breath for 40 seconds until you feel the first distinct urge to breathe. And that's the bolt score.
And the urge is is there something that tells you when what that urge is? Is it like a contraction of something? Or?
Yes. Yeah. Not everybody feels the contraction, but a contraction is pretty common. If you think of it like you're holding your breath, carbon dioxide is increasing in the blood, and as a result, then blood pH is dropping. And the chemoreceptors in the brain are monitoring CO2. And at some point, carbon dioxide increases above what it's programmed at, we'll say. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it sends a message via the phrenic nerve to the diaphragm to breathe. So the diaphragm contracts. So it's the first involuntary movement of the breathing muscles. So you may feel it as your diaphragm. It's the first distinct reaction that your diaphragm contracts, or you may feel the breathing muscles in the neck. Because they're linked, there's the same signaling happening with whatever's in the diaphragm as well as the breathing muscles the muscles in the neck. They can contract as well, so it looks like a swallow. Gotcha.
Okay, gotcha. Well, we've kind of jumped into this really quickly. I'm concerned that people that are listening have no idea the context of what we're even talking about. So,
sure.
Why don't we back up a little bit and give people some context, and if you can just give us like a Reader's Digest version of your thesis, because it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. You're breathing too much, people. You're breathing too much. Where have you ever heard that before? Nowhere.
It's very strange when people first hear of it. But then again, as human beings, we have to consider there's a certain amount of food we can eat every day. If we eat too much, we're in trouble. If it's too little, we're in trouble. There's a certain amount of water we must drink every day. If we drink too much, we're in trouble. Dr. Timothy Noakes, he's a physiologist from South Africa, and he wrote a book called Waterlogged. And he said that many athletes are stopping off at many water tables during a race, and they're drinking too much water. And this has caused people to die as a result of it during long races, including marathons. So the human being, there's a certain parameters that we must meet, and especially with breathing. But when we talk about breathing, nobody seems to know how much air should you breathe. And when we look at the importance of a function, the importance of a function to the human organism is determined by how soon the organism perishes when you switch it off. You can live without food for weeks, you can live without water for days, and you can live without air for just a few minutes. So it's vital that the volume of our breathing must meet certain parameters. Now, many things change our breathing. And I'm talking about our breathing during rest. I'm talking about our everyday breathing. How do we breathe every minute, every hour, every day? Because it's how we breathe every day that determines how we breathe during physical exercise. Now, we've got so many influences of modern living that are increasing our breathing. If I look at an individual who is, say, living a very modern life, they're working all day in an office, they have no time to do physical exercise, they're eating processed food, they're putting on weight. I look at their breathing during rest, and you'll notice it. It's hard. There's a relatively easy to see the amplitude of their breathing. You can see the breath coming into the body pretty easy. You can see the breath leaving the body pretty easy. There's no natural pause between breaths. They often breathe using their upper chest, and they often breathe using their mouth. And that's poor breathing. Now, if that individual goes and does physical exercise, they're going to be breathing hard during that physical exercise, not because of the overweight, but because of the poor breathing patterns that they've developed. Now, surprisingly, I've seen elite athletes with poor breathing patterns because physical training doesn't change your breathing. And this is the one thing about breathing, because it's breathing that sets the limits of physical endurance. And it's breathing that pretty much sets the limits, because that intense feeling of breathlessness, that's what's dictating the intensity at which that runner or that athlete can continue. So it's very important to look at our breathing. And the other thing about breathing is the harder we breathe, the more oxygen consumption that's devoted to supporting the breathing muscles. Because normal breathing, normally we consume about 2 to 3% of our oxygen consumption. At rest is supporting the breathing muscles. During moderate physical exercise, it's about 3 to 6%. During pretty intense physical exercise, it's about 10%. And during maximum physical exercise, up to 15% of your oxygen consumption is going to support the breathing muscles. Now, if you breathe hard, a lot more of your oxygen is going to support the breathing muscles, and less is going to be used for, say, for instance, your legs or arms. So in terms of breathing, I think it's really important to change it. And I think it's really important to look at it.
How is it that we don't, I thought it was really interesting when you talked about how automatic it is that we start breathing through our mouths. And
yes.
Just because it's easier, we can get more air. Why did that occur? Why do you think that has happened? That change from we used to be nose breathers? I'm guessing.
Yeah, no, we were totally. We're born with our mouths closed. Our ancestors were breathing through the nose, and if you were to look at primitive groups of people, they will be nose breathers. Mouth breathing is a very modern aspect. It's possibly related to a change of diet. There was a book written back in the 1930s called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration.
Weston Price, right?
Weston Price.
Yeah.
And, he looked at various civilizations, and he noticed that on one civilization he went to were the Gaelic people living off the Hebrides Islands. And on page 55 of that book, he says, these people, they were living on a traditional diet of fish and oatmeal. And when commerce started coming to the island, commerce brought sugar and jams and marmalades and chocolate and all this good stuff. But he said first generation children became mouth breathers. Now, if you're familiar with that book, Andy, if you look at the photographs of the traditional people, they have got beautiful wide-faced structures. They've got very wide jaws. They've got jaws that are well positioned on the face, and they've got really good airways. And then when it transitioned to a processed food, the face is becoming narrower, the teeth are becoming overcrowded, the jaws are getting weaker, and the jaws are set back in the airways. And this is a massive problem. And this is a problem that, the amount of crooked teeth nowadays, crooked teeth are not because you've inherited your dad's big teeth and your mom's small jaws. That's nonsense. That's, it's not about that. The problem is that our jaws are too small to house the 32 teeth that we have as adults.
Yeah.
And that's what's causing overcrowding. If you look at, a really brilliant athlete, you look at their jaws, and traditionally a strength of a man was always emphasized in his jaws. I was in Sydney. There was a guy there. He was Singapore's strongest man for 7 years running. And this guy, strong man, but I was fascinated the width of his jaws. And if you were to look at our ancestors, if you go to a museum and you look at skulls there, and I've looked at them in a number of museums, you'll see that there was perfect room for all teeth. They had this really wide Roman, if you were to look into the palate of the mouth, you see this wide U-shaped top jaw. Well, the U-shaped top jaw is formed by the shape of the tongue. And it's only if the tongue is resting in the roof of the mouth that it can form that shape. So as we're growing up, during critical growth periods during our childhood, if we have the mouth closed, our tongue is resting in the roof of the mouth, and it's our tongue that's driving the face forward. So literally, it's pushing the jaws forward on the face to make room for the airway. Now, I was a mouth breather for 20 years, and with gravity, my face sank downwards, my nose is bent, my maxilla, which is my top jaw, is set back, my mandible is set back, I had a high upper palate, I had overcrowding of teeth, my nasal cavity was infringed, I have a deviated septum. That's all as a result of inefficient breathing patterns. And this is really well documented in the literature. Like what I'm talking about isn't new. In 1946, I have a paper, and the debate there was the malocclusion as a result of oral breathing. So basically crooked teeth due to mouth breathing. And this debate is going on, and there's some brilliant orthodontists. You've got Dr. Bill Hang or Dr. William Hang. He's in Agora Hills there, just outside Los Angeles. And this man, I think he's just approached his 70th birthday. He's been looking at children's faces for probably about 40 years. And his whole emphasis is, if I'm treating teeth, I need to get that child breathing through the nose, because it's breathing through the nose that will ensure the success of the treatment. And it's super. He's aware of it.
Does he immediately tell them they got to tape their mouth closed at night, like I started doing as soon as I read your book?
Yeah, but no, I'll tell you a good one. He tapes his own mouth when he's doing long haul flights, you know. And I just come back from Sydney there at the weekend. I had a 24-hour flight, and my God, if you want to witness sleep apnea and snoring around you, go on a long flight. But he tapes up, so you know, it's one of those things. For young children, we do at a certain age, but we try and get them taping during the day first. Now, would you believe 50% of studied children are mouth breathers? 50%.
Wow.
Now, the effect of this is, and I'll do it in a nutshell, it causes forward head posture because you're trying to get the tongue out of the airway. You get a narrow palate, longer face, poorly developed jaws, and it sets you up at risk for sleep apnea for the rest of your life. Wow. Mouth breathers have poorer academic achievement. They're more susceptible to ADHD. The brain consumes more oxygen when you breathe through your mouth. But when you breathe through your mouth, it gets less. And this causes central fatigue. So the brain gets fatigued. And this was a 2016 paper.
Now, wait, say that again. I think it's really important. When you breathe through your mouth, you get more oxygen, but during mouth breathing, the brain is wanting more oxygen. The oxygen load on the brain, the demand of oxygen by the brain increases, but the oxygen delivery reduces. Because your CO2 levels are not high enough.
That's correct. And the carotid arteries, the main blood flow that are feeding oxygen to the brain, you can reduce your oxygen delivery to the brain by up to 50% from breathing hard. And this is coming back to what you were talking about earlier. We were kind of having a bit of fun about the whole concept of overbreathing. But here's the crux. If you overbreathe, less oxygen gets delivered to the tissues.
Right. Rich, makes no sense. Like without you here to explain it, makes no sense. Like if I had somebody on the street tell me that, I would just kind of, what?
Yeah.
Move on.
Sure.
That sounds ridiculous. Yeah. It sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, but it seems total. But when people experience it, like how many people breathe hard during their sleep and they go to bed at night and, I'll just talk about a man here, and the wife is waking up because the man is really breathing heavy. He's breathing hard. He's bringing all of that oxygen into his body, but he wakes up exhausted. If you get stressed, you start breathing hard. And if you start breathing hard, you can't think straight. And what happens if I said to somebody, take 20 big breaths in and out of your mouth? You're going to feel lightheaded. You're going to feel dizzy. So the thing about this is, in 1904, there was a Danish physiologist called Christian Bohr, and he said that the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the blood is very important. Carbon dioxide is not a waste gas, or it's not just a waste gas.
Right.
It's correct that the body breathes to get rid of excess CO2, and the body is very sensitive to a buildup of CO2. For example, normal CO2 in the lungs should be 40 millimeter of mercury pressure. And if there's an increase between 2 and 5%, if CO2 mercury pressure increases by 2 to 5 millimeters, ventilation doubles. So the body is really sensitive to the buildup of it. However, when we're breathing, oxygen passes from the lungs into the blood. And in the blood, oxygen is carried in the blood by two forms. One is hemoglobin carries most oxygen, and hemoglobin is a protein in the red blood cells. That carries most of the oxygen. And then there's a small amount of oxygen that's dissolved directly in the blood. Hemoglobin carries 70 times more oxygen than what's dissolved in the blood. So the main carrier of oxygen in the blood is hemoglobin. Now, if you were to measure somebody's blood oxygen saturation, just while they're breathing lightly, you'll see it's almost fully saturated. if you tell that individual to start breathing harder, they're not going to add any more oxygen to the blood. But as you breathe hard, you get rid of CO2 from the lungs, and this directly influences CO2 in the blood. So your alveolar CO2 determines your arterial CO2. The harder you breathe, the more you remove CO2 from the blood. The more you remove CO2 from the blood, it's going to influence CO2 from the tissues and from the cells. For oxygen transfer to take place from the red blood cells to the cells, you need carbon dioxide. But if you're breathing too much, you're getting rid of CO2, and what happens is that the red blood cells will hold on to oxygen. It's not just good enough to have oxygen in your blood. We need to get the oxygen out of the blood into the cells. How do we do that? We need carbon dioxide. Don't breathe too hard, because you get rid of carbon dioxide and your red blood cells will hold on to oxygen as opposed to deliver it.
It just, I hear you say that all, and it makes sense. And yet it is such a bizarre, I was a trumpet player. For 20 years, I played at a pretty high level. I went to the Eastman School of Music. My whole first 20 years of my life was all music. And I learned very early on how to breathe out of my diaphragm and yes. how important breathing was. But to me, in my way of thinking for my entire life, carbon dioxide was something you wanted to get rid of. Carbon dioxide was not a valuable substrate in the world of breath and breath breathing and taking a deep breath. And taking a deep breath was so important. So it's such a bizarre thing. And yet, your book, The Oxygen Advantage, was so effective at delivering that message that I immediately started taping my mouth closed at night, and much to the chagrin, I actually didn't have that tape, so I started using Band-Aids. I put a Band-Aid across my mouth.
That's
That's
a really good idea, by the way.
Really?
We've some of our clients using it. It's a really good idea. Band-Aid works, would you believe? There's a dentist in Colorado, Dr. Frank Seaman, and he invented a lip seal tape. He is a dentist. He was complaining that his patients were coming in. He'd put crowns on them, and they'd come back a few months later because of bruxism. They were grinding their teeth in their sleep, and they were breaking the crowns, and he was kind of getting fed up with this. He was also seeing that the mouth breathing people coming in, they had inflammation of their gums, they had more dental cavities, they had more, gingivitis, etc. And he said, listen, we have to sort this out. We have to get these people nose breathing. So he started taping. But coming back to this, Andy, we know that if you do the opposite to heavy breathing, you can influence your body temperature in about 3 to 5 minutes. And that's what I always do. Like when I'm working with somebody, I want to show them a number of things. If you want to open up your nose, and your nose, by the way, is directly linked to your lungs. If there's inflammation in the nose, it will travel down to the lungs. And if there's inflammation in the lungs, as in asthma, it travels up to the nose. So a lot of people with asthma also have a blocked nose. If your nose is blocked and your mouth breathing, your sleep is affected. So people with nasal or allergic rhinitis, they're twice as likely to have sleep problems. When somebody comes in to me, I show them, if you want to open up your nose, you simply hold your breath. This was documented since 1923, that in order for man to open up his nose, to decongest his nose, all he had to do was hold his breath. So we have an individual do this 5 times. Breathe in through the nose, breathe out through the nose, pinch your nose, walk around in your bedroom, in your hall, wherever. Keep walking until you feel a pretty strong need to breathe. Then let go, breathe through your nose, calm your breathing. Breathe normal for about a minute, repeat it, do it 5 times, your nose starts to open. Now that's because of a buildup of CO2. That's also because of a buildup of nitric oxide in the nasal cavity, etc. And then when I'm getting people, the main thing what I talk about is I ask people, how do you breathe if you're stressed? And they tell me, well, I breathe faster, I breathe more using my upper chest, I sigh more, I have irregular breathing, I hear myself breathing, and I often feel caught for air. And I say, look, if you take a deep breath, and what do you do? And they say, I'll take this big breath. And I say, did you breathe faster? Yes. Did you breathe using your upper chest? Yes. Did you take more air into your lungs? Yes. Was it like a big sigh? Yes. In other words, the deep breath that people are commonly taking, all it is an amplification of already stress breathing. And if they take 5 or 10 of those deep breaths, to start getting lightheaded. Now, if you're stressed, the best way to bring your body from stress into relaxation is to do the opposite to stress. And all it's all about breathing through your nose and breathing really slowly and gently and softly. And we go one step further. We want to slow down breathing to the point that you have air hunger. Because, as I said earlier on, carbon dioxide is the stimulus to breathe. And if you really slow down your breath, not hold your breath, not freeze your breathing, but gently slow down your breath, carbon dioxide accumulates in the blood, you feel air hunger, but within 3 to 5 minutes, your blood circulation will improve, you'll feel warmer, you'll have increased watery saliva in the mouth, and you'll feel drowsy. Now, there's 3 minutes to 5 minutes. We can influence the physiology of the human being by doing the opposite to what has been taught for years, for decades, across all modalities of health,
Yep.
And the proof of the pudding is, put it into practice. If you've seen somebody walking down the street and they're breathing hard, at the very least, you're going to say they're unfit. Or, when I'm working with athletes and the coach says to me, yeah, we often, from time to time, we're going to see athletes and they're very breathless for the level of exercise. And the coach is putting it down to lack of conditioning. Mm-hmm. But it mightn't necessarily be lack of conditioning. It could be just poor breathing. This individual is breathing through their mouth during their sleep. They're breathing through their mouth during the day. And they've developed poor breathing patterns. And then all of a sudden, they're expected that their breathing is to get right during physical exercise. It's not going to happen. How you breathe during physical exercise is a reflection of how you breathe during the day. And we have to get breathing right during the day.
Well, it's interesting. I go back to the example I used about running. When I tell an athlete, and I work with kids, playing soccer. When I have a kid that doesn't run fast, I can't just say to him, run faster. They have no connection to how to run. I mean, I have a couple kids that play baseball on the team, and they look like they're literally they're leaning backwards and sticking their legs out in front of them and trying to pull themselves forward through space. I mean, that's an exaggerated, it's an exaggeration, but no wonder, of course they can't run fast. Of course they can't, and no matter how many times you tell them run faster, they don't get it. They don't understand how to do it. So I totally get what you mean. You can't just tell somebody, well, breathe better or breathe, it won't work. It won't work.
Yeah.
Going back
you can
to
show them.
The breathing lightly is something you call in the book called breathe light to breathe right.
Yes.
And is that it's funny because as a competitive athletic person, I feel like that exercise is so little. It doesn't feel hard enough. It doesn't feel like I'm doing any sort of breath hold. Like it almost doesn't feel like I'm doing something that would actually work or be effective. So I tend to I'll walk around the block and I'll do a 10-minute walk and I'll, every minute I'll do a breath hold.
Yes.
I'll do that instead of breathe light to breathe right. So I wondered what's more effective? What's better? What is, are they both equal or what do you say?
They're both, probably the breathe light could be more important. The functional movement screen, they wrote a paper. I don't know if they actually wrote it, but it was looking at the functional movement screen, which
is that functional movements? Yeah. FMS. Yeah, that's
FMS.
That is what's his name? God, his name just blew out of my head. Gary
Cooper, is it?
Not Cooper. Gray Cook.
Okay.
Gray Cook.
I'm not, but basically the paper, it was talking about the FMS as a predictor of injury amongst athletes. And what they did was then they looked at athletes, they looked at their breathing, and they found that the athletes with poor breathing performed poorly on the FMS. So basically, if you had dysfunctional breathing patterns or upper chest breathing, that it was more likely to be a predictor of injury. And the whole premise there was that your diaphragm, which is your main breathing muscle, it provides stability to the spine. So in terms of changing breathing patterns, the one thing about the breathe light is it's deliberately getting you to slow down and reduce your breathing to increase carbon dioxide in the blood to get the increased CO2 to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, to reset your breathing to a higher set point of CO2. And basically that means that your ventilatory response to carbon dioxide is going to be reduced. Now, to make that a bit simple for you, when we do physical exercise, we generate carbon dioxide. It's a normal product from the metabolism. If we have a strong reaction to carbon dioxide, our breathing is going to be heavy because we're getting rid of it. Because the body breathes to get rid of excess CO2. Whereas if we have a reduced ventilatory response to CO2, we can tolerate it. And our breathlessness, we don't get so breathless for a given level of physical exercise. Well, that's reflective of the BOLT. So the higher the BOLT score, the more physical exercise you can do with lighter breathing. Now, if you can do physical exercise with lighter breathing, it means you can push yourself harder. And the other thing is, if you're breathing lightly and you've got good end tidal CO2, and if you're breathing through your nose, you will tend to have more, you'll have a higher end tidal CO2 breathing through your nose versus breathing through the mouth. Carbon dioxide is necessary for oxygen transfer to get place. So if you've got a good BOLT score and you've got good end tidal CO2 and a good tolerance to carbon dioxide, it means that more oxygen is going to get delivered to your cells. So you're going to stay aerobic for longer. So you can work harder and stay aerobic, as opposed to if you're breathing hard, there's not enough oxygen getting to the cells, so you're going to go anaerobic quicker. Another aspect of it is we do want deep breathing. Deep breathing, though, is by your nose. Deep breathing is not through your mouth. If you look down at your chest now, Andy, or if any of your listeners look at their chest, and if they take a breath through the mouth, they're not going to see their diaphragm move. They're going to say that, mouth breathing directly links to the chest. Now, if you have an individual that's going around with the mouth open all the time, they're going to be chest breathing all the time. Now, what's the problem with that? Well, if you were to look at the lungs, the greatest concentration of blood in the lungs is in the lower lobes of the lungs. And if you're breathing through your mouth, you're taking most of your air into the upper lobes. So here's a problem, because the air isn't meeting with the blood so readily. And this reduces ventilation perfusion. Now, when you breathe through your nose, you bring the air deeper into the lungs. So by breathing through your nose during the day, you get more functional breathing patterns, including using the diaphragm, but you get a better gas exchange taking place. And also, when you breathe through your nose, you pick up the gas nitric oxide, not nitrous, but nitric oxide. And by carrying nitric oxide into your lungs, nitric oxide redistributes the blood from the lower lobes to the upper. So I just say that again. Nose breathing brings the air deep into the lungs. And as you breathe through your nose, you pick up nitric oxide, and that brings the blood in the lungs up to the upper. So that's a better ventilation perfusion. And that's why it's been shown that Swift in 1988, they found that when individuals post-jaw surgery, that their oxygen uptake was 10 to 15% higher by breathing through their nose versus breathing through the mouth. Nose breathers are better oxygenated, and they've got better oxygen uptake in the blood. They've got a better oxygen delivery to the cell. But the other thing about nose breathing is it causes you to slow down your breathing during the day. There's a 50% resistance to your breathing. So when you breathe through your nose, you're forced to breathe slowly. And Stanford Medical School in March of this year, they located a pacemaker in the brain. Now, we're all kind of familiar with the pacemaker in the heart, and they said there's a pacemaker in the brain. And this pacemaker is spying on your breathing. So it's located above the breathing center. It's continuously spying on your breathing. And if you breathe fast, the pacemaker relays signals of agitation to the rest of the brain. And if you really slow down your breathing, the pacemaker will relay signals of calm to the rest of the brain. So we can influence our mental state by changing our breathing. But if we breathe through our mouth, we'll be breathing faster all of the time. We breathe upper chest, we breathe faster, it activates the fight or flight more, and we're more agitated. Mouth breathers, if you put mouth breather into Google and see what you come up with, it's a stupid person. It's not that the person, like you could say, yeah, they're stupid because they don't realize, they're going around with their mouth hanging open, they don't realize it. And we have to consider 50% of kids fall into this bracket. Nobody is telling them any different. And with adults, we don't know the percentage of adults going around with mouth breathing because nobody is studying it. It's just too simple. Breathing is breathing. Why change it?
Yeah,
well, I was a mouth breather for 20 years. And I tell you one thing, you can't be a mouth breather and be 100% productive.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because since reading your book, I've been very conscious because I train about an hour every day. I go to the gym and I'm usually very vocal in class. Like I'm very animated and I have a really good time, you know, kind of heckling. It helps me be light and loose and have a good time and have fun. But
Sure.
since being more conscious of my breathing, when I do that, I'm breathing through my mouth. I mean, you can't talk and not exhale through your mouth, right?
Yeah, well, it's true. And talking does influence your breathing, but you know what? Go and have fun. I wouldn't be too worried about the mouth breathing in a short period, you know, here and there. We're looking at it 24/7. We're looking at the accumulation of it as opposed to just a bit here and a bit
Well,
there.
no, but what I was going to say is you know, it's really forced me, especially during the time that I'm really training hard, to practice. It's not comfortable, you know, like you start snotting all over yourself when you keep your mouth closed and you're going at these higher rates. And at first it feels like you're actually going slower than you would if you open your mouth. You know, I've also found some of the things like when I have to put a lot of effort in, like if I'm doing a max pull-up set, or maybe not max, but just, you know, 15 pull-ups or something.
Yeah.
When I get to the higher end and I go to give that extra oomph, it's very difficult not to breathe through the mouth.
Yeah, yes.
You know, during those times.
It'll depend on a number of things. One is bolt. The higher the bolt score, the more efficient the breathing. And the second thing is, it's been studied in terms of what's the workload that you can attain by switching from mouth to nose breathing. It's 85 to 90%. So it's not 100% because there is a resistance to your breathing. But really, when we look at this, we look at the quality of the breath. If you breathe hard and breathe through your mouth, it's causing blood vessels to constrict. And one organ that's receiving less blood is going to be the heart. The harder you breathe, the heart is a muscle that pumps blood around the body, but the heart needs its own blood flow and its own oxygen delivery. But if you breathe hard, you've got reduced coronary blood flow and also a left shift of what's called the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And this is the premise of the Bohr effect. This is what I was talking about earlier on. Getting rid of too much CO2, the red blood cells hold on to oxygen. Well, any of your listeners who want to look into it more, just put into Google, just put in oxygen dissociation curve or the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. And you'll see it straight away. This is a curve that's described in any pretty medical textbook, and it will tell you exactly how oxygen is released from the blood to the cells. So yeah, going back to physical exercise, for recreational athletes, we'd always say people, breathe through your nose. You get a better workout, a better recovery. It's safer because your nose is letting you impose. Your nose is imposing the limits of your exertion. So you're not going to overtrain as much. Whereas if you're an elite athlete, we have them breathe through their nose. We have them do strong breath holds, but we also have them mouth breathe so they don't have muscle condition. So there's kind of a different approach to a recreational athlete versus an elite athlete.
What do you mean you do mouth breathing? What I missed that last piece.
Say, for instance, an elite athlete. So say if I was working with sprinters, you know, to give you an example, a 400-meter sprinter. So I'd have them, during some of the sprints, they sprint with their mouth wide open because I need them to be simulating what they're going to do during a match. But during some of their practices, I'll switch them to nose breathing during some of those sprints. And literally then there's some of the sprints, then I stand on the 375-meter mark. So these guys are sprinting with their mouth closed, sprinting all out effort. And once they see me at the 375, they have to hold their breath. So the last 25 minutes, they have to run without air. And the reason being is because the body is going to be most fatigued in the last 25 meters. And it's the last 25 meters whether they win the race or not. So that's the time to put the extra load onto them. It's the same with MMA guys. You know, we're doing breath holding to disturb blood acid-base balance. And, you know, we don't use devices. The only device that I use is a pulse oximeter because I think it's very helpful for an athlete to measure, you know, what is the saturation of the hemoglobin with oxygen. So they use a small little handheld device. You put it on the finger and it's got a little red light in it and it detects how loaded is the hemoglobin with oxygen. So basically with athletes, we'll drop their blood oxygen saturation to about 85%. And that's at about a height of about 5,000 meters. Now, what I'm doing there is I'm putting them into a state of acidosis. I'm making them hypoxic. And as a result, then the hydrogen ion that's coming from the cells isn't getting neutralized because there's not enough oxygen.
Right.
And what's happening then, I'm exposing their body to a very high buildup of hydrogen ion, but I'm also exposing them to a high CO2. And carbon dioxide then dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So we do a breath hold on the exhalation. We create a hypoxic effect, which generates hydrogen ion. We also create a hypercapnic response due to the buildup of CO2, and that creates a buildup of hydrogen ion. So we have a double hydrogen ion effect, and that forces the body then to improve the buffering capacity. So then during a race or during a fight or during whatever endeavor, the body's ability to neutralize or delay lactic acid, delay fatigue improves. So we're doing it on a number of levels. Another thing about
when they go into their fight, they're not nasal breathing. I'm guessing.
No, God, no.
They're normal.
Breathing. Yeah. If you're in a fight, you do whatever you have to do. Yeah. But say, for instance, if somebody is in a chokehold, we're doing fairly strong breath holding, and that's conditioning the individual to actually tolerate it and to become comfortable with it. Like, if an individual, I think people need to practice that. If part of MMA is that you're in a chokehold, well, what happens if you panic? Because you feel the buildup of CO2, but you don't quite realize what's happening and you have to tap out. As opposed to do breath holding on land and condition your body to be able to tolerate these changes in blood gases. So it's almost as if there's a psychological thing that, yes, if you are in a hold, you'll be able to handle it for a longer period of time. And maybe that period of time will give you enough time to be able to do something about it or not. But I think these are tricks that people can be using. And we do some of these as well in terms of breath holding really activates the sympathetic response. So pre-match competition, I have athletes doing 5 or 6 major breath holds before a fight, before a race. But then I have them hyperventilate to get rid of the acidosis. So I have them do the breath holds to get increased blood flow, but basically increased oxygen carrying capacity. Because you can increase your red blood cells by doing breath holds. So it lasts for about 10 minutes. So if it was for a sprint, it'll be perfect. But I don't want them too acidic going in because that's going to increase their ventilation. So I get them to hyperventilate to get rid of it, get rid of the carbon dioxide. And I don't want to get rid of too much CO2 because it will cause blood vessels and airways to constrict. So there's a happy medium there. So we experiment with different things in order because the human body is so intelligent. And I think when we understand about breathing, what we can do with it, I actually think, Andy, that breathing is going to be the next level in sports. It's been underrated. It's been, nobody's been looking at it.
Yeah.
But when you look at the breakdown of what we can do with simple breath hold exercise and by changing breathing, it really, there's something in it.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's really remarkable. I mean, I hear everything that you're saying, and yet it seems so, it seems so basic. Now, let me ask you this. So with breath holding, how, if you're going to simulate a high altitude environment, because I know you cover this in your book.
Yeah.
It seems like, I haven't tried it yet, and I bought a pulse oximeter. They're only like $15 on Amazon. So I have it. I haven't, that was one of the interesting things is, one of the things you say in the book is that you no matter how deep a breath you take, you're never giving yourself more, you're always saturated with oxygen. You've always got 96 to 99% saturation. So what is it you're really doing when you take those deep breaths? It's not changing anything. It'll change something small. It changes the amount of oxygen dissolved directly in the blood. But the problem is that the big breaths. Okay, I'll go through that again. So your SpO2, the little pulse oximeter that you use, which is measuring how fully loaded are the red blood cells with oxygen. And that's normal. It's when you're sitting down resting, it's 95 to 99%. Normally it's about 97%. If you start breathing harder, you may increase it by 1 percentage point, but it's insignificant because you're already almost fully loaded. Right.
And you don't want 100% because you actually need the red blood cells giving off oxygen. So you have a constant diffusion of oxygen from the red blood cells to the cells. So 100% isn't good, because 100% would indicate that the bond between the red blood cells and oxygen is too tight. So if you start taking, say, 10 or 20 or 30 big breaths in and out, it's not going to increase the amount of oxygen saturation in the blood. It will get rid of carbon dioxide. And that's the problem, because it's the getting rid of CO2 that causes your blood vessels to constrict, of which you have 100,000 miles of them. And secondly, that the bond between oxygen and hemoglobin strengthens. Now, 30 big breaths, though, it does increase the amount of oxygen dissolved directly in the blood. But the amount of oxygen dissolved directly in the blood is very small. It's 3 milliliters of oxygen for 1 liter of blood. 70 times more oxygen is carried by the hemoglobin. So I would be more concerned about having the correct environment for the hemoglobin to release oxygen, as opposed to just increasing the amount of oxygen dissolved directly in the blood. So if you were to hyperventilate for 30 big breaths and then do a breath hold, you're going to hold your breath for a lot longer, because you've got rid of CO2. And this is why we don't do hyperventilation. It would be very problematic if you were in a swimming pool. Traditionally, swimmers, what they used to do is they'd stand at the side of the pool and they'd take maybe 20 big breaths, and they would deplete their carbon dioxide levels. You can halve your CO2 levels in the blood in the lungs within 30 seconds, half. So if you're getting rid of CO2 from the lungs and from the blood, you've just depleted your alarm to breathe. So the swimmer breathes, they have 20 big breaths, they get rid of CO2, then they get into the pool, they're swimming in the pool, but they don't feel a sensation to breathe. And the next thing is their oxygen levels are dropping, and they have a blackout, and they possibly could drown. And unfortunately, people have drowned.
Wow.
You can't get rid of the stimulus to breathe. The stimulus to breathe is carbon dioxide. And it is true, like, if you do have 30 big breaths, you are going to hold your breath for a lot longer. But if you're going to do that, do it on land. Don't do it underwater. So we don't do the hyperventilation aspect of it. We just do normal breathing and do breath holding. You know, most athletes, not even athletes, like I teach these to 5-year-old kids, by the way. I have a book written for kids from 3 years of age to 10 years of age. Kids coming in with asthma, with blocked noses. And, that was always my work traditionally, because I was an asthmatic. And you can get any person to, once like they're healthy, we don't encourage, if a female was pregnant or if somebody comes in with high blood pressure, serious medical conditions, we don't want them to do breath holding, because breath holding is a pretty big stress to the body. But it's good. Sometimes it's good to stress the body a little bit, because the body makes adaptations. So within a week, anybody can drop their oxygen saturation. And I'll give you the exercise over there. If you want to try it, if you had your pulse oximeter with you, do you have it there, by the way?
I have the box here, and it's not in it, but I could go grab it. You want me to go grab it?
Well, do you know what? If you want to do an experiment, we can do it. Now, I'm not like, this won't work 100%, but it may work or it may not work. But I'll give you the instruction anyway. Sure, maybe we'll just carry on. If it was there easy, I can give you the exercise anyway. So, are you still there, Andy?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay.
You want me to grab it really quick? I mean, I can do it while you're doing it.
Yeah, do you know what? Go grab it.
I know right where it is.
Go grab it.
Hold on.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, I got it.
Cool.
Stick it on. Okay. It's
okay.
on.
So it'll take you. Generally, the SpO2 is the top breathing, and basically what that's measuring is what's the saturation of the peripheral capillaries with oxygen.
Yeah, I'm at 98.
And it gives 98, so it's perfect. Yeah. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to have you stand up, and if you stand pretty close to this so you can hear me.
Okay. Yep.
And take a normal breath into your nose and a normal breath out to your nose. And I need you to start walking. Now, when the air shortage gets stronger,
Can I just walk in place?
Yeah, you can walk on the spot.
Okay.
Now, when the air shortage gets stronger, I need you to jog. And the stronger the air shortage, the faster I need you to move. Or you could even do squats.
Should I be holding my breath or not holding my breath?
Yes, of course.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
So I'll talk you through it again, yeah?
Okay.
So take a normal breath into your nose, a normal breath out through your nose, and pinch your nose and hold your breath. And start walking. and start relaxing into the body. And after a few seconds, you'll start noticing the breathing muscles contract. When you feel the air hunger getting stronger, go faster, move faster. Now, when you really need to breathe, let go, but minimize your breathing for 6 breaths. So when you really need to breathe, let go, but take hardly any air in and out of your lungs for 6 breaths. So 6 breaths, hardly any air, Andy. Hardly any air. Only sips of air in and out. So I need you to continue with an air hunger. And I need you to continue with an air hunger for about 20 seconds. There is a delay between the time that you stop breathing to the time that you witness a desaturation. So keep on reducing your breathing, minimal breathing, minimal breathing, minimal breathing for about 6 breaths, and you should witness the SpO2 drop. Now, if it drops below 91%, it's hypoxic. If it drops to 87%, you're in pretty severe hypoxia, and we don't need to go below 80%. So I think this will be interesting because I don't think you've said you've done this exercise. So this is just a test. Can we do it off the bat?
I got down to 89.
Yeah, well, it's there. That's
wow.
So that's about 4,000 meters high at rest. Now, the beauty about this is that this can be practiced anywhere. What you've done there is you've completely disturbed your blood acid-base balance. That will change the buffering capacity. If you were to do 6 to 10 of those per day. The other thing is, did you feel your breathing muscles contracting when you were holding your breath?
A little bit, yes.
So as you do it, you're putting an extra load on your diaphragm because you can't get in to train the diaphragm. So by breath holding, your brain is going to continue sending a message to breathe. Your diaphragm is going to repeatedly contract. You're adding an extra load onto the breathing muscles, and you're going to strengthen.
If I was to do 6 of those, would I start the next one again before the pulse ox went back up and I started normal breathing, or would I let it come back up?
There's different exercises. One of the exercises, the advanced exercise in the book, it's exercise number 7, but I wouldn't suggest to do it straight off because it's pretty tough.
Okay.
With that exercise, you can hold your breath for, say, well, it says in the book between 40 and 60 paces. But you could even do it for 10 paces. And then it's about taking a sip of air and holding again. And then a sip of air and holding again. And with that exercise, it's pretty extreme because we want the individual to desaturate, that their oxygen levels drop, but we want them to hold it there for about 1 to 2 minutes. But normally when you do those exercises, kind of leave a minute in between each, because what will happen is that if you don't leave a minute, there's going to be a buildup of CO2. And the buildup of carbon dioxide is going to prevent you from having a stronger breath hold the next time.
Right.
So, like, I always play with these. You know, when we've got athletes, we'll try any combination. We try quite a few different combinations of exercises. And, you know, they're wonderful. Just to give you a couple of things about that. Number one is that's exposed your body to an extreme state of breathlessness. It may be that, you know, from a psychological aspect, you're able to tolerate more breathlessness. But even there may be, say, if you were to look at the central governor theory, that you're training the brain to be able to tolerate, you know, hypoxia. You're training the brain to be able to tolerate diaphragmatic fatigue. But you'll also notice if you were to do 5 of those, it'll open up your nose. It'll also open up the lower airways, and it'll also make you more alert because it stimulates. There's a bit of a stress to it. Mm-hmm. It adds an extra load onto the breathing muscles. And if you do 5 or 6 of those breath holds, your spleen will contract. Now, your spleen is your blood bank. That contains 8% of your red blood cell count, but the quality of the blood in your spleen, which is an organ located under the diaphragm, the quality is very, very high. 80% of the blood within the spleen is hematocrit. It's oxygen carrying capability. And normally for a male, for example, their hematocrit, which is the percentage of their blood which is carrying oxygen, is between 40 and 50%. Whereas the blood in the spleen is 80% is hematocrit. So when you do 5 breath holds, your spleen is sensing that there's a drop of oxygen in the body. And as a result, it starts releasing more red blood cells into circulation. So it improves your aerobic capacity. If you're doing breath holding long term, it increases EPO. Well, it'll increase EPO in the short term, but it will take a while for the increased EPO to generate more new blood cells. Your hemoglobin increases, your oxygen carrying capacity increases, your anaerobic capacity increases. your respiratory muscle strength increases, your tolerance of breathlessness improves, and you open up the airways. That's all you're doing with one simple exercise.
Wow. And that does that, if I did a series of those, does that help my Bolt score as well? Do all these things build? All these things build on one another.
Yeah, all of those, they're all interconnected. Now, the breathe light, though, is pretty important. If you were just to rely on doing strong breath holds, it wouldn't be sufficient. And the other thing is taping them out at night. Even we would have individuals do 15 minutes of reduced breathing, breathe light before they go to sleep, especially pre-match, pre-fight. If there's a fight the next day or a match the next day, I need athletes getting up alert. I need them with full focus the next day. I don't want them having a disturbed sleep and they're waking up tired, because there's not a chance. If your head isn't in it, if the individual wakes up tired, their head is not going to be in it the following day.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure the sleep is right. And breathing through the nose is the key to having a good night's sleep. Now, again, this has been well studied. It's been well documented that if you're mouth breathing, if you've got allergic rhinitis, if you've got hay fever, that your sleep is going to be adversely affected. And if your sleep is adversely affected, you wake up fatigued. Whether you're an athlete, whether you're a normal person, it doesn't matter. Sleep is sleep, and breathing through the nose is key. So, yeah, it's looking at breathing from a number of different perspectives. Everyday breathing I want to look at, sleep I want to look at, breath holding, and also incorporating this into an individual's training so you get the most out of the training.
Now, so a couple questions for normal people out there. So I've never done any, this is Joe, whoever's listening to the podcast. Never done any breath hold work, never done any, I have no idea if I'm a mouth breather or I'm a nose breather. Or I have a kid that's, say, 10 years old, never done any work on mouth breathing. How do you suggest they begin? What are the steps for a real novice at this?
Sure.
Who's a little nervous, by the way. I mean, they hear the word tape your mouth shut and they're like, oh my God, what?
Well, maybe just don't start off taping them out, unless you're you're an innovator, you're really an early adopter at that stage. But no, you know what? Start paying attention to your breathing. Do you wake up with a dry mouth, for example? If you see your kid watching TV, is the child there sitting there with the mouth hanging open? If you're doing simple physical exercise such as walking, do you walk with your mouth open, or do you walk breathing through your nose? Sit in a cafe, look out in the street and watch people walk by. 40% will walk by with their mouths open, mouths hanging open. All they're doing is simple, light physical exercise, and they're not able to breathe through their nose. Also, it's very important to have the tongue resting in the roof of the mouth, because during sleep, you don't want the tongue falling back in on the airway. So what one person could do is, I did a TED Talk, and in the TED Talk, I wasn't there about just talking about theory. If you talk about theory, you lose people, and people don't always get it.
Right.
So I had them practice it. I had them do the nose and blocking exercise, and I had them do the breathe light exercise. And I had people experience the improvement in body temperature. I had them experience the improvement in the amount of saliva in the mouth, because if we get stressed, the mouth goes dry. So it's activation of the sympathetic response. And if we go into deep relaxation with meditation, we get increased watery saliva in the mouth. So increased watery saliva is the sign that your body is going into relaxation. And reduced breathing does that. So practice it. Google TED Talk, Patrick McKeown. Try the exercises and ask, does it make sense? If you can influence your body temperature, if you're going around with cold hands and feet, if you're going around with brain fog, if you're waking up exhausted in the morning, if you're highly stressed, if you're going around with your mouth open, dry mouth, all those things are having some negative impact. And it's really important for children. And Andy, we had a philanthropist about a month ago contacted us, and we have an online course for children. We were charging $50 for it. Now he said, I want to give this free for every child, no matter where they are, anywhere in the world. So for 6 months, our entire course is free online.
It's all right now. It is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
How do you get there? What's the web address?
So you go to, we've two websites. One is our health website, is buteykoclinic.com. And if you go to, that's Buteyko clinic.com. And then if you go to, I think it's Learn. So if you go to Learn and then scroll down to, I think it might be DVD sets. So you scroll down to DVD sets and then you'll see a series of different DVD sets, but keep scrolling down for children and then click on the children's page. And all you do then is you'll see, to access this, send us your email address. And basically when you put in your email address, username and password is sent directly to your email address. So you've got access then to that course indefinitely.
Wow.
So
that's amazing.
That was on the basis of the philanthropists putting it available, and we put it available ourselves because we didn't want any children, regardless of income, being deprived of the ability to learn to breathe through their nose. We've given that out. That course has gone out to volunteers in Africa. So it's gone to some very, very poor regions with a lot of kids suffering from asthma. And I had two papers, published. I can't remember the exact journals, but they're under the American Thoracic Society in May of this year. And I was a co-author on both papers looking at mouth breathing asthmatic kids. And we improved all parameters in asthma, FEV, FEC, spirometry readings, but we also improved these kids' sleep. If you have asthma, if you have nasal obstruction, your sleep is affected and your stress is affected. We have to get these kids breathing through their noses. Nobody is telling them to breathe through their nose,
right.
Andy.
Right.
And there's no side effects from nasal breathing.
Right.
Sometimes I really have to wonder, where are we going with this in terms of health? And it's the next generation that's the key. And it's not just me that's now talking about nose breathing. I've been talking about nose breathing for 20 years. Dr. Christian Guilleminault is a Stanford-based medical doctor. He discovered obstructive sleep apnea back in the 1970s. He discovered the condition. He coined the phrase obstructive sleep apnea. And he's not talking about it, but writing papers since 2014 about the importance of nose breathing for children. And I quote directly, "The only valid and complete correction of pediatric sleep disorder breathing is to restore nasal breathing both during wakefulness and for sleep." Now, he didn't just say breathe through your nose during sleep. He said breathe through your nose during the day. And that's what we want to get out. That's the message. And it's not just for kids, but of course we want kids to breathe through the nose. It's for everybody. So, yeah.
Yeah, no.
So what I'll do is I can send you the link as well. I'll send that, if any of your listeners want access to that, it's pretty easy you could go to buteykoclinic.com/Buteyko children, and that'll get you straight to the page, and then just scroll down and it says click here to access free online course. Click on that, and I think you have to put in your email address, and that's it. You'll get it straight off.
Wow, it's fantastic. I am so grateful to that, and for your, I forgot I wanted to ask you this question. How did you get started doing this? I mean, this is not a normal, you didn't study this in college. Nobody studies this.
No, it's not. This isn't studied in college.
Right.
I had asthma. I came into this completely by accident. I had asthma since I was first diagnosed with asthma when I was about 4 years of age. I'm not sure exactly when. It could have been when I was 5. And I had asthma all the way through my teenage years, right up into my 20s. And the amount of medication I was taking was increasing. But I was tired all the time as well. And my concentration was really affected in school. I was a mouth breather. I was in the corporate world. I went, finished my degree. I was in economics and business. I was in the corporate world. And one day I was reading an Irish newspaper, and it spoke about the work of a Russian doctor. And part of his work during the 1950s and 60s was determining the ideal composition of oxygen for astronauts. So this was part of the Soviet space race, that he was a researcher involved with that. And he was a medical doctor as well. He was working with patients. And he said two things. He said, breathe through your nose, and he said, breathe less. Now, I was a chronic mouth breather. My nose was totally stuffed. So what I did was I started doing the breath hold exercise. And within 5 minutes, I was able to start breathing through my nose. Now, it wasn't easy. I felt a bit suffocated, because usually if you've got years of mouth breathing, when you start breathing through your nose, you feel that you're not getting enough air. But I persisted with it. And within about a week, my asthma reduced by about 70%. And that's not an exaggeration.
Wow.
I also taped up my mouth at night. And I started waking up feeling alert. And that was the first time feeling alert as well. And it was just a major change. Now, I still stayed in the corporate world because that's what I had trained for. That, you know, I had a master's degree, and I wasn't going to couldn't suddenly leave it.
Yeah.
But it was about 2 years later, or 3 years later, I was driving, and this thought came in that I have to start teaching it. And I contacted the Russian embassy the following Monday to track down the Russian doctor. And I went over to him and I trained under him.
This is Dr. Buteyko?
Yeah. So in 2002, then I trained in Russia, and he gave me my diploma, and I come back then. I started teaching it in Ireland, and then I started writing books. Like originally it was mainly for asthma because that was my interest. But then I started looking at snoring and the relationship, because people with asthma were getting better sleep. And I said, there must be some connection here. And then I got contacted by dentists, and dentists asked me, will you talk to our patients? And I said, yes, because they were aware that the mouth-breathing children had more dental issues and crooked teeth.
Right.
So started working with those. And then anxiety, because I had a whole awareness that, you know, a love for the breath and following the breath and taking attention out of the mind. But also, like mindfulness is brilliant, but it's not addressing dysfunctional breathing patterns. If you have an individual going around fast breathing and mouth breathing, it's just simple. They're not getting enough oxygen to the brain. So you can do all the mindfulness in the world, but unless your breathing pattern is addressed, you know, there's something missing there. So I wrote a book on mindfulness back in 2010. And I was traveling. I've been traveling since 2005, talking internationally. I'm talking like about 4 weeks ago, I was at the World Sleep Fair in Prague. That's one of the biggest sleep fairs, 1,500 medical doctors.
Wow.
And then I went to Hong Kong and I trained at a hospital there in Kowloon. And that was, we had ENTs and speech and language pathology, etc. And then I went from there to Australia. Next week I go to next week I go to Poland. And about 2 weeks after, then I go to in Los Angeles. So that's where it's gone. Like, and it was 5 years ago I started looking at the whole sports aspect, putting the dots together, looking at the breath in terms of the mind, breath holding, sleep, every parameter that I could think of. I put a chapter in cardiovascular health in athletes. I started looking at, well, what happens if you breathe hard? Well, if you breathe hard, it alters ECG readings. You can have ST segment depression, inverted T waves, and these are predictors of sudden cardiac death. And I was trying to put, well, why are these athletes having sudden cardiac death? Could they be breathing excessively for their given level of physical exercise? And these predictors can change within a minute of heavy breathing. It doesn't take all that much. And this is not new stuff, you know. Back in 1908, Jan Del Henderson, he was a professor of, I think, Yale University, but he did experiments with dogs. Now, it's not a very nice experiment. He mechanically ventilated dogs by using bellows, you know, the hand bellows from a forge. And he had the dogs breathe more, and he would elevate their pulse rate up to 200 beats per minute. Mm-hmm. And then he would slow down the bellows, so the dogs breathed less, and he would bring down the pulse rate to 40 beats per minute. And then when he took the dogs off the bellows, some of the dogs died. And they died as a result of breathing too much. So, and CPR, because I included this in the chapter as well, medical rescue, you know, emergency personnel would often arrive at a victim who was requiring CPR, and they would ventilate the victim too much, and sometimes they were killing them.
Right.
So since 2007, they've taken out ventilation. Right. It's only now chest compressions.
Right.
And people sometimes think it was due to the hygiene of mouth to mouth. It wasn't. It was the fact that you can't be breathing people too hard, because if you're breathing too hard, it's counterproductive. And this is where the breath is really tying in. And there's a huge surge of, you know, I think there's a change in awareness in the last 2 to 3 years, especially the importance of breathing through the nose and getting the simple information out there. If you want to get more oxygen delivered to your cells, your breathing should be light. And I know, you know, this is going against what's often taught in Western yoga and Pilates, by stress counseling. But, you know, my advice to anybody who questions it is, you know what, put it into practice. Try it for 2 weeks, or even just try it for 3 minutes and see, does it change your body physiology? And that'll tell you.
I've got to tell you before we wrap up here. I know you mentioned her name in the book, Joy Moeller.
Yes.
So Joy was introduced to me by my dentist. I don't know, this is like 12 years ago.
Wow.
Because we were working on my jaw, and I have the classic small upper jaw. I had to have 8 teeth pulled when I was in high school because I didn't have room for my teeth.
Yeah.
And I thought he was a little bit nutty, my dentist. He's like, you can make some of these changes through adapting the way your tongue operates in your mouth. And me being me, I'm like, well, what the heck? I might as well check it out. And I met Joy, and I worked with Joy for like 3 months. And it really made a difference. And when I heard her name in your book, I'm like, oh my gosh, how crazy!
It's a small world.
It's a very small world. Yeah.
Yeah. I met Joy 10 years ago, and she's absolutely wonderful. Her work is wonderful. The amount of children that she's been helping, and the simple information, getting kids who are mouth breathers, and if they've got poor oral habits like tongue thrusting, or it's really about developing the muscles of the face,
right?
And these kids can be helped so much. Their academics are helped, their concentration is helped, their mood is helped, because they're setting them up for life. I actually meet Joy, so when I go to Los Angeles, it's with Joy. It's with Joy and Mark, so I'm connected very much with them. I teach the breathing re-education as part of their module.
Wow.
It's a small world, so that's great. But Andy, maybe those 8 teeth shouldn't have been removed, and that's really the crux of it.
Right.
Like if you were to talk with so many orthodontists now, they're saying, the problem is not that the teeth are too big. The problem is the jaws are too small.
Yeah.
Now let's improve the width of the jaw. And you put in a small appliance, and it gently widens the jaws.
I had one of those. I used one of those. My son actually had one of those, and I'm going to work with my son on some of this breathing, because I really don't know how he breathes, but I'm guessing he probably breathes through his mouth. So,
well, many kids do, and if they do, they do. But at least now you're becoming aware of it, which is the key.
Yeah. Well, this has really been phenomenal. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're incredibly busy, and it's so important. I can't really... I'm looking at your website. I'm looking at some of these DVD sets I've got to get that I'm like, I can't wait, actually, because it's so, I think you're right. I think it's the next, when you think about the most important things you can do for your health and well-being, you kind of ignore breathing, because it's so, it's just part of, like, it's like your heart beating. Like you can't, you think you can't do anything about it. But actually, you've shed light on the fact that you can do something about it, and there are different ways to do it that actually would be more effective, and they're life changing. They are literally life changing.
Yeah. On that website, Andy, on the health website, ButeykoClinic.com, if you scroll down on the homepage, there's a tab there, Children's Development or Childhood Development. If you click on that, I've put up about 50 papers of the effects of mouth breathing on children. I talk about ADHD. I look at the incidents. I look at their teeth, their sports, their academic achievement, their speech, their asthma. The entire child's life is affected. On oxygenadvantage.com, I've put up a tab on science, because anything I say, because I'm going to have criticism, because this is something new. It flies in the face of what's out there, and I want to do my best to support everything I say. I put up a tab on science. I have many, many papers up there, and you can click on them. You'll get the abstracts, and you can check it all out. You can do your own research, put it into practice, and that's what I've tried to do with the book. I put in 37 pages of references at the back of the book, so that it's solid. Yes, there's some stuff that we don't quite know. We don't know how example, we're getting the nose unblocked. We know it works. I had it published in 2013 in the journal Clinical Otolaryngology that nasal symptoms were reduced by 70% at 3-month follow-up. But how it works, we don't know. Breath holding unblocks the nose. And I think that's more important about that as opposed to the theory behind it. But where we can, we're always going to try and support it with theory.
Yeah. It's fantastic. I'm on that tab right now, and it's extensive, the amount of stuff you have on there. So the amount of research and background and videos and interviews and so I just want to thank you so much for you making this part of your life, and it is your life. It is your life, and your mission.
Pretty much.
And well, it's so great.
I was lucky. I found something I love to do, so it's great. It's easy.
Absolutely. And it'd be really fun to meet you next time. I don't know how busy you'll be. I'm sure very busy, but it'd be really fun since you're coming to Los Angeles anyway to connect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a course. It's in the Millennium Biltmore. Downtown. Pop into it any of the days. Okay. Just bounce me an email and just pop in. Turn up, show up, sit in for a couple of hours. You'll meet other healthcare professionals there. You take notes, do what you want, take the information, and I'm happy to get it out there. So that'd be really
fun. Thank you again, and good luck.
No worries.
Good luck in this movement, because I don't know if you need luck. It's gonna catch on.
Luck is always good.
Luck is good. Luck is good. All right. Yeah. Well, take care.
Thanks very much, Andy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye. Bye-bye.
The Whole Life Podcast is produced by our podcast team, Winslow Jenkins, Becca Borowski, and Ernie Hurtado. You can find all of our episodes, links, and complete show notes at wholelifechallenge.com/podcast. The way that I've found is the best way to listen to podcasts is to subscribe so that episodes automatically get delivered right to your mobile device. You can do that in any podcast app on your phone. And hey, if you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Go to iTunes and give it a 5-star rating. And recommend it to your friends. I'm Andy Petronic, and thanks so much for listening.